We heard a lot of interesting ideas there, but if the convention happens, who's going to hear those ideas? What people will actually be at the table when the parade of experts on various reforms come before them? Our next speaker is going to talk to us about some models about how the delegates might be chosen. Our next speaker is named Stephen Hill. He's come down from San Francisco. He's been in the trenches of electoral reform for a very, very long time. In the last decade, he helped bring about public financing of elections and instant runoff voting, the first city in the United States, in San Francisco, to allow voters to actually rank their choices for the city council. And now he is the political reform director for the New America Foundation in California. Please welcome Stephen Hill.
Sound check, can you hear me? Yeah. Should I speak up more? Are you all ready to put on your white wigs and become the founding fathers and mothers? Very good, because we're going to need you. As Mike said, if we're going to have a constitutional convention, a rather obvious question as you start thinking about this is, well, who's going to sit in that room and decide these things? How are we going to select these delegates? And there's three basic ways you can do this. You can appoint them, you can elect them, or you can select citizen delegates by a random selection process using the pool of all Californians. And there are pros and cons to any of these methods. There's no perfect here. But there may be, as you look at it, perhaps a least worst method that we can focus in on. So let's just look at these each a little bit. And this is just meant for you to think about. It would obviously take a longer discussion to really decide this sort of thing. But if appointing delegates, those who want to appoint delegates tend to think, well, that will allow us to get the best and brightest in California. But the obvious question is who would do the appointing? Would it be the governor? Would it be the legislature? Would it be some other body? Some have proposed, well, let's take all the good government groups and lock them in the room and let them figure this out. Well, who would pick the good government groups? So the question of who would appoint strikes at the very heart of the legitimacy and the credibility of this body. And also, if you appoint them, is no guarantee that those appointed would really represent the great diversity of the state of California. So there's pros and cons to doing it by appointment. And also, I think it's instructive, perhaps, that of the 14 states that have an automatic call for a constitutional convention, none of them appoint their delegates. So that's something to be aware of. Let me move this down a little bit. I feel like am I ringing a little bit?
You're doing good.
So let's look at the second choice, electing delegates. If we elect the delegates, to some degree, that would confer a degree of legitimacy, since then we could say that those are the ones that are elected by California. And it also would be very familiar to us and to the media. And it's a process that we're used in a democracy to electing bodies that have power and influence. So it does give that sense of legitimacy to it. However, think about how do we elect them? What would be the structure? Will we use the current legislative districts? So the assembly districts have 450,000 people. If we use the assembly districts, that means the candidates to be elected would need quite a lot of money to run in districts that size. It means they would probably have to go to certain groups to get that money and certain individuals. They probably would have to go to the usual organizations and even party organizations to get the endorsements to be able to become known to all of the voters. So in the end, if we elect them, would we end up electing a constitutional convention that looks very much like our legislature?
Right.
And if that's the case, then, well, maybe we've knocked out the knees of it before we even started, because the legislature is not exactly held in very high regard right now. So again, if we're going to elect, the devil is in the details a little bit. Some have said, well, maybe we should do sort of county conventions and elect them that way. But again, it raises the question, who in the county level would be in charge to elect, and who would be charged to be nominated? I mean, county caucuses, for example, many states used to use county caucuses in their partisan election processes, and they became known as sort of the place where zealots tended to dominate, the activists and the zealots. Depending on your point of view, that's good or bad. So these are the sorts of things that would have to be thought through very carefully if we elect them. And then also, if we elect them, again, there's no guarantee that those elected would be truly representative of the state and the great diversity of the state of California. So then looking at the third option, citizen delegates, or using a random selection process, as it's called, to get a scientifically representative sample of Californians. This procedure is actually gaining a lot of attention right now, in part because the other two have some real downsides. And with this method, what you would do is you use a pool of Californians and you do a random selection process. And the proposal that's been put out there by the Bay Area Council, for example, is to randomly select 400 delegates. If you randomly select a body that large and use the methods that have been devised for doing these sorts of things, you're going to come up with a very representative sample of Californians. In some ways, it will be more representative than the current state legislature is. I mean, other places that have used these sorts of methods, you literally get people like truck drivers and waitresses and nurses and people who just normally don't have a chance of getting elected to any sort of bodies like this. They get selected, and they agree to do it. If we did it this way, they would be paid. You would start most people think that the Constitutional Convention would probably last about 8 months. The first 6 weeks or so would be a very intensive education process for these citizen delegates, in which experts would be brought in from all different sides to give them the benefits of their analysis about what both the problems and the solutions are. So you really would have a very ramped up sort of education process with citizen delegates like this. Now, you know, the obvious question that comes to mind with something like this is, could citizen delegates have the expertise and have the knowledge to really engage in the type of analysis of the complexities that California faces? Or as one skeptic put it, how could a room full of dummies come up with something smart? Now, you know, we have to face that that viewpoint is out there, and I sort of, we actually just released a report in which we went and we researched a lot of citizen delegate type processes that have been going on in the United States, dozens of them that maybe some of you have heard about and others have not. And I just wanted to fill you in a little bit about some of the examples we've seen that really, when you look at them, sort of gives you faith that maybe this citizen delegate process actually could work. For example, in New Orleans, after Katrina, they had a hard time coming up with a redevelopment plan, all the special interests involved and, you know, pointing fingers and what have you. So they created a process using practitioners of what is known as deliberative democracy, in which they brought together 4,000 New Orleans scattered across 21 different cities. So the diaspora that was out, that had fled New Orleans, were able to be wired in using things like live webcasting, the internet, keypad polling devices, and all these different methodologies and techniques that are available today in the deliberative democracy world to convene 4,000 people to weigh in on what should be the redevelopment plan for New Orleans. And that actually became the basis of the redevelopment plan that finally got passed by the city council and all the different authorities that had to sign off on it. And so they tapped into the genius of we the people, so to speak, to design that redevelopment plan. In New York City, after the tragedy of September 11th, they had to rebuild the site of the World Trade Center. It became extremely controversial. A lot of different people's fingers in the pie. They couldn't figure out what to do. They convened a process like this in which they ultimately brought in about 5,000 New Yorkers who participated either online or in meetings, large groups, small groups, over the web, all these sorts of things, in which they ended up coming up with the criteria that New Yorkers wanted to redevelop this site, and that then became the basis for the eventual plan that was adopted. And the critic of the New Yorker, the architectural critic of the New Yorker magazine, said he couldn't believe that he would ever have witnessed something like this, that thousands of New Yorkers would be able to participate in a very complex, very emotional process to come up with the criteria for redesigning this site for the World Trade Center. He said, in his words, this in some ways remaps how we do architectural design from here forward. So these sorts of methods have been used in California as well, and other states to weigh in on things like taxes, on regional development, on health care, lots of different issues, very complex issues in which average people are randomly selected, brought into the room, and then they go through a process to really get them to think about what should be the program and the redevelopment in that situation. And when you read the accounts of these different places that have used this, one thing that really comes to mind for me that I thought is really tapping into something important that we should think about is that, of course, when you pull together 4,000 people, or if we have a delegate convention of 400 people, you're going to bring in Democrats, Republicans, Greens, Libertarians, people from all over the political spectrum. And in fact, that's what you want, as well as people of different ethnicities. But what has happened in these events where they've used these methods and these techniques is that when people get there, they check their partisanship at the door. Because they recognize that it's really important that they work together to come up with solutions. Suddenly, you're sitting across the table, or you're sitting across the video link with the person who's your polar opposite. They completely don't agree with you. And yet your goal becomes to find common ground with that person because you have to come up with solutions. And you also don't, once you have a group of citizen delegates like that, you don't have people that are thinking about this in terms of their own careers, right? You don't have incumbents that are there trying to, or their proxies trying to figure this out in terms of their careers. You don't have the partisans there. You don't have the special interests there. So when we look at these different selection methods, what we may find is that this citizen delegate random selection process may be the least worst method. They may bring the qualities to the table that we really are going to need in redesigning what some of us are calling California 2.0. And that's where I asked you at the beginning, are you ready to get your white wigs on and to be the founders, mothers and fathers? Because some of you may be randomly selected in this process, and some of you may end up sitting at that table being part of the redesign of California. And so really ask yourself, are you ready to do that? Do you really believe you could do that? Do you believe your neighbors could do that? I think this is the intriguing question that I'm certainly listening to people and getting their viewpoints on. We actually did do a poll, and I'll wrap up with this. We did a poll on this in 2006, asking Californians whether they would agree with a citizen delegate process for reform. 73% of respondents said yes. In fact, many more Californians said they believed in the ability of Californians to design this more than they believed in government officials, or even more than they believed that independent experts could do this. So Californians I think are ready to go here. And I think it's also, it's the type of deal where we've always had to rely on we Californians to do this. And this may be a time when we Californians have to step up to the plate once again because we can design this thing better than anyone else.
Thank you, Steve.